Hello and welcome to today's video. It is short but super important because it explains to you why you should consider getting your English exam remarked when you take it. So I'll show you why that's such a really powerful idea, and I'll also show you why the examiner is trying to cheat you out of marks, not because they're cruel or immoral, but because they're forced into a really tricky situation by the government. And that means they have to design the exam so that lots of students will do badly in it. Well, let me show you what I mean. If we focus on the number of students getting grade 4 and above compared to 3 and below, this will be clear. So what's interesting is that the language papers added together add up to 160 marks, and so do the literature papers. But the number of marks you had to get in those papers to get a grade 9 or an 8 or a 7 or so on are actually very different. Now, what's weird when you look at this is you only need, I say only, you only need 123 marks to get a grade 9 in the language, but you need 141 to get a grade 9 in the literature. You only, again, I'm not being sarcastic here, you only need 113 marks to get the grade 8 in the language, but you need a whopping 127 to get it in literature. But that pattern doesn't repeat all the way down. Literature isn't higher than language all the way down. Look what happens here. To get the grade 4, you need to get 72, but to get the grade 3 you need to get 53, and on literature it's suddenly dropped to 49. The 4 was 72 and the literature is only 66. Okay, well, let's first deal with the question of why this means that you should consider asking for a remark. Well, because in the language grades, it means the gap between one grade and another is round about 10 marks on those crucial grades, as you can see. 10 marks at grade 4, 11 at 5 and 6, and so on. So you can see that if you do badly on one question, say question 5, so the two question 5s are worth 80 marks, 80 marks for the two question 5s. If the examiner messes that up, what are the odds that they will be between a grade boundary? Well, the odds are really high, aren't they? They're quite high that out of those 80 marks, the examiner might get 10 wrong, which is a whole grade boundary. But imagine you were, only 2 or 3 marks away from the grade boundary. The chances of a remark putting you above it are massive. Now, in literature, the reverse is the case. Because the gaps are much bigger, 17, 16, 16, 16, a remark is much less likely to see the examiners change their mind. And the other thing is there aren't any massive questions in the literature. The literature questions only go up to 30 marks at most. So the chances of one examiner completely screwing up your whole grade are much smaller. The chances in the language exam are much, much bigger. Okay, well, this prompts our next question. How can the same exam board create such a brilliant exam with literature where there's a huge range of marks that students get and really even and large gaps between the grades? How can that exam board produce an exam where there's a much smaller range of marks, from 16 to 123 compared to 16 to 141, and where the gaps between grades are much smaller, as you can see here, and also where you have to still get such high numbers of marks to get the grade 4. This is a disaster. How did this happen? Well, it's happened for two reasons. So let me explain them both. Reason number one is the government only allows about 72% of students to get a grade 4, and that's in maths and English literature and English language. So these are the results nationally. English literature, as you can see, is around 72% of students getting the grade 4 or better. These are cumulative percentages. The reason that maths and science are smaller is because these numbers, if we look at the difference between the students entering literature and the students entering language, there's about a £40,000 difference, 40,000 student difference in AQA. This is entering for the language and the literature. And most of that number is the students who are older who have had to retake. And obviously, students who are retaking, most of them failed the first time, and then most of those then fail the second time as well. And that's why the overall percentage of students getting the grade 4 is lower. But if we look at the percentage of 16-year-olds taking it for the first time, then it will be around the 72%. Okay, so when you have that cutoff, it means that if you've got lots and lots of students getting high marks, well, some of them have still got to get a low grade, because you can't have everybody getting grade 4. Government won't let you, even if every single student in the country was grade 4 standard. Okay. Right, well, let's go back to the language marks, and now that makes sense. So here you had to get a really high mark to get a grade 4, because lots of students taking English are still good enough to get the grade 4. Well, that's a massive problem if you've got to take only 72% of them. So what does the examiner do? Well, they try and make the paper increasingly difficult in artificial ways. They have lots of secret ways to make you fail so that not that many people, not that many students will get the higher marks. And as you can see, even with them cheating you in the exam this way, they still haven't wholly succeeded, because for grade 4 and above, the gap between the grades is still very small, therefore prone to lots of error. Well, why did that happen in language and not in literature and not in maths? Well, this is the reason. Even the laziest student in the world can still be brilliant at English language. For example, if you just love reading, but you don't do any work in school, you can still get a grade 9 in English language, because you basically imitate great writers and you understand great writing. That's all the exam is. So it's very possible for somebody who's completely lazy to ace the English language exam. Conversely, every other exam that you take, probably, you can't get by just being lazy. If you haven't studied the texts and memorized your quotations in literature, well, you're just going to fail, simple as that. And that's why it's really easy to construct a fair literature exam, but it's really hard to construct a fair language exam. If the language exam was fair, what we'd see is the grade boundaries for a grade 4 being much higher, because what you'd find is 72% of the students would get much, much higher marks because they're actually quite good at English language. But that would be a disaster, because then the gaps between grades would be much, much smaller, and consequently the error between judging whether you were a 6 or a 7 or a 7 or 8 or whatever would be much, much harder. There'd only be 3 or 4 marks between grades if you did it that way. And that would be an absolute disaster, because loads of people would get the wrong grades. Well, it's still a disaster because loads of people are getting the wrong grades now. So hopefully you've seen why the exam board need to find artificial ways to make you do much worse at English language. And in my next videos, I will show you exactly what those ways are so that you can beat them. Beat the examiner, get the top grades. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to find out more.